Can you set up what the theory is about?
Well, I was thinking about this after our earlier talk. I don't really think about it as a theory. I think about it as a framework that describes American history and other history that they were brilliant enough to see, which again, no professional historian could have. I mean, these were two well-educated guys who had thought a lot. And Neil Howe did have some background as a history graduate student, but never wrote a dissertation. But they had the courage to go with ideas in a way that a professional would not. So the big thing they picked out was the 80-year cycle, of course, of a great crisis every 80 years that redefines America. They found one in colonial America. I won't get into that. But then they had the Revolution and the Constitutional period. 80 years later, the Civil War. 80 years after that, the Depression and the Second World War. And then the exciting thing was, of course, that back in 1996, I guess it was, or 7, they said, okay, let's do the math. And another 80 years is going to take us to about 2010. So that sometime in the first 10 or 15 years of the 21st century, we're going to be in another great political crisis. Now, the book got very mixed. The books got very mixed reception when they came out. The Fourth Turning in particular. I think the only really good review they got in a major outlet was written by myself. What is amazing to me is that the ideas still don't resonate much either in mainstream journalism or in academia, even though no one could deny that that key prediction has pretty obviously come true.
Basically, what were your first impressions of the Fourth Turning, Darius?
Of mine? I mean, I came into it, I didn't read the book until later. I believe it was my twin brother, Cole, who is also a moderator in the group, who originally came upon the theory, and then, you know, he told me about it. And of course, I went on like the Wikipedia page and looked through it. And then, of course, I read the book reviews for it and all of that. And I just saw it as a way, since at the time I found it, I was still in, I want to say, the 12th grade when I came upon it. And it was just a way for me to organize history, you know, clearly in my head. And so sort of like David was saying, that it's not quite a theory, but it is a framework for how to think about history. And I think it does a very good job at that, even if, you know, the details of the theory are hotly contested. But I think the core part of the theory that's actually of some use is the, of course, main portion about the crisis every 80 to 90 years. So
we basically have a first turn-in high period, much like with the post-war 1950s, basically focused on recovery and building, high conformity. How would you describe a first turn-in, David?
I would say the biggest thing is there's a consensus on what the fundamental truths of history and life are. And again, you see, when you've read this stuff, you begin to recognize all sorts of things in your reading. And as you know, one of my favorite people from the same archetype as me is W. Du Bois, who was born in 1867. That is, he was born 8 years after the Civil War. I was born 2 years after the Second World War. So we're very parallel. And in his autobiography, there's a passage about his youth. He says, when I was a young man, the great truths of life were certainly known. We knew where we were going. There was arguments about how we would get there, but there was no questioning. And then writing this in 1930, says today everything is different. Well, I recognize that atmosphere from my youth. The great truths have been established by the outcome of the crisis, and they're not questioned. And it's generally a time with a high birth rate, as it was then. Time of growing population, although actually not always. The Europeans didn't have that kind of first turning this last time, I discovered later. And of consensus, and politically it tends to be another very active era when both sides can work together. And again, movies are so helpful, particularly for people who didn't live through all this. And the movie Advise and Consent, which is a wonderful movie about politics in that era, made in that era, really gets this across. It's also characterized by pretty strict gender roles. But that last high was critical because it was the era of maximum equality in all of American history. And that had shaped that previous crisis. And it was an era also, as the high usually is, I think, of very high public investment in schools and houses and interstate highways, and a lot of resources devoted to public good. Unfortunately, my generation that grew up with that took all that for granted and began thinking about all the fun they could have within this framework.
During your coming of age years, right?
Keeping it alive. I beg your pardon?
During your coming of age years, right?
That's when it started, yes.
The two
But
T.
then came the catastrophe, the great mistake of my parents' generation, the Vietnam War, which convinced so many of my contemporaries that we didn't have to believe anything they ever said or try to preserve anything that they had left behind. All through the awakening, the older generation, the GI generation, is still in charge and doing a pretty good job in many ways. There's a GI consensus that crosses party lines, which is why, for instance, as you often mention, it was Richard Nixon who signed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. I don't think those were his favorite pieces of legislation, but they were passed by bipartisan congressional majorities, and he was going with the flow. So the awakening is a great time to be alive in many ways.
It was the birth of the new Hollywood film system with Steven Spielberg, Woody Allen, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola.
Absolutely.
It was basically,
yeah.
And I feel like the birth of film in general, like back then, going way back to the 1800s, was actually during the tail of an awakening, the gay 90s, right? Would you say?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So who knows what may happen to the film industry during the next awakening? And I know
Good
you
question.
talk on the film industry. I wanted to actually work our way up to the crisis because I feel that that's going to take up the bulk of the conversation. So you have the second turn-in basically ushers in, it divides the consensus, would you say, leading to
yes.
a third turn-in, an unraveling of the 50s conformity, where you have culture going at war with each other.
Yes, and now in the unraveling, which lasted, we think, from about 1985, 84, 85, to somewhere between 2001, 2008, depending on your point of view. After that.
It's our favorite debate.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
That and when millennials
anyway, yeah, the millennials are being born, right. There is a slight tightening of the culture, particularly when it comes to child rearing. The parents raise millennials much more carefully than they raised Generation X, that was born in the awakening. And awakenings are great times to be a young adult, but they're terrible times to be a kid. And Gen X was marked by that because nobody's paying attention. So the unraveling.
We'll pay attention to
the restraints
episode.
Okay.
Take your time.
Yeah, right. The unraveling, it was an era in which immigration really took off, which actually has happened in the previous unraveling as well. The economy was taking off in new ways. A lot of the restraints of the crisis and the high were coming off. Taxes were going down. The concentration of wealth was beginning. And as the boom generation takes over politics, they become much more partisan on both sides. And thus, a key figure in the unraveling is Newt Gingrich, one of the most influential boomers, actually, I think, of our time, who put the Republican Party on a new track, both in policy terms, trying to undo as much of the New Deal and the Great Society as possible, and in political terms, by really starting an endless propaganda war against the Democratic Party. I'm sure Darius, who's so political, has seen Newt Gingrich's vocabulary list of words for good Republicans to use about Republicans and Democrats, which is still going on. And then the way the Republicans refused really to accept the legitimacy, even of Bill Clinton, really a very centrist figure politically, was a portent of things to come.
And so after you have the unraveling, I feel like it reaches a boiling point much like the 1850s, where like society has to choose what do we stand for? We're tired of arguing. What do we stand for? Let's figure that out. As that happens, old institutions fall, new institutions are raised. And one of the biggest things, this is where we could get into the opinion now. I wanted you here, Darius, and I wanted you here basically to help set up the theory, a literal sense of the theory. Now we could get into our opinion as far as when did the 4T start? This current 4T. There's no doubt that we're in a crisis right now with the corona virus pandemic. Politically speaking, the 2010s have been very turbulent for politics, partisanship, war, realignment of all the parties, with a major one happening in 2016 for the Republicans. It's been a very turbulent time. A lot of the populist move, the rise of populism, Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party.
Political gridlock.
Political gridlock. You could speak to that, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Just an overall trend of course, that was starting in the 90s, like David said, with Newt Gingrich. This move towards really, polarization was already on a steady climb from pretty much 1980 onward, but it really just took off into the stratosphere after 1994, when Newt Gingrich, becomes Speaker of the House, and that pretty much starts a 20-year trend to where we are right now, where we're headed to.
25 years now.
Yeah, 25 years actually. Yeah, you're right.
And so I focused a lot on the 2010s. We didn't really get too much into the 2000s. Obviously, we have the 2008 crash, which put us into a recession. That's the Great Recession. That's definitely a crisis moment. Strauss and Howe, they have the turn-in starting at 2008 currently. I believe it used to be 2005. The theory is not predictive. So I don't believe that they claim to be prophetic, but their estimated date was 2005. And I think that Neil Howe has settled on 2008. But what are your thoughts? Do you feel that the crisis started at that time?
Well, I don't, although I concede that all this is very tentative and we may not have a firm view of it for many years. The reason I don't is that the essence of the fourth turning, as I see it, is that a new party or a new version of an old party sets out to transform America in important ways. So that was all of the revolutionaries during the American Revolution, even though they bifurcated in the Federalists and Republicans. That was the Republican Party in the 1860s, a new party that not only fought the Civil War, abolished slavery, but changed America in other ways as well. That was the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt, who changed it into something very different from what it had been for most of its history, and who gave the government a new role in the economy and gave the U.S. a new role in the world. Now, my allegiance, as you both know, is to Roosevelt and the New Deal and those principles of the Democratic Party. But as a historian, I really think the story of this fourth turning is really the more determined Republican attempt to undo so much of what was done, and really to do so in many very ruthless ways. Now, in 2000, you have the way the Republicans handled the disputed election, and which was just to try to win it by any means necessary, and treating the question of who actually got more votes in Florida, which the best count turned out to show was probably Al Gore, as a non-issue. In other words, they had what they wanted and they were going to get it, and they did. Then, after 9/11, okay, here's one of my big questions, which I tried to get an answer once for, and I couldn't. I certainly don't think George Bush has read Generations of the Fourth Turning. It's not the kind of thing he would spend his time doing. But I certainly think Karl Rove might have. And I once reached Karl Rove's office maybe 5 years ago when I was writing one piece on all to ask if he had read them. And his secretary refused to ask the question for him, so I didn't find out. But I think I might have, because then comes 9/11. And they tried to use 9/11 in a classic Strauss Howe kind of way, I think. They were able to rally the country behind them initially, and they tried to use it to design and implement a completely new foreign policy based on the transformation of the Middle East with armed force, with other means, and so on. And meanwhile, they were using this moment, paradoxically, to push their low tax, low regulation economic agenda. So for the first time in our history, they were cutting taxes more than once during a war. Now, the terrible thing for them and for us was that all of this turned out to be a mistake, and it didn't work. The whole Middle East involvement has had very negative results for us, for the people in the Middle East. So that the major positive purpose of the fourth turning, which I think is to give new generations confidence in our leadership and confidence in a revived set of institutions, did not take place. Then we get Barack Obama, and then you have the economic collapse, which further discredits institutions. Now, Barack Obama was a very intelligent man, very well qualified in many ways, would have been a great president during a high, I think, which is more in keeping with his birth year. I mean, he was quite young to become president when he did. But in the crisis, the whole policy he took suggested to me that at bottom he was convinced that there wasn't anything fundamentally wrong with our system. That we're in a temporary crisis. He had these advisors who just said that if we threw enough money at the big banks, everything would be all right. So that's what we did. Did some stimulus, which helped, but not that big. And didn't really challenge the fundamentals of new foreign policy. And thus, as it turned out, he and the Democratic Party he now represented was not able to rally a new coalition behind them the way Lincoln and subsequent Republicans did, the way FDR and Truman did. And thus in 2016, the way I want to put it is, and I'll stop after this, neither major political party can produce a candidate who can defeat a reality TV star of very limited capability to be president. And here we are.
Is your start date 2000?
I'd just say 2000, 2001, in that era. 9/11 was more significant, but the election was a real sign of where we were going.
Okay.
As was the role the Supreme Court played in resolving it, because the Supreme Court has emerged as such an important part of what the Republicans do.
And so, Darius, when is your date, your start date?
So I kind of want to preface my date by, saying that, of course, you have this crisis, and we all have this discussion all the time about, yes, it's the event, but it's also a question of how do we respond to the crisis? And do we respond in a way that is sort of status quo and the usual, or does everybody, change what they're doing, or at least does leadership change what they're doing in order to, I guess, address, whatever the crisis may be. Now, the argument for 2000, I see it because really it was the beginning of, at least, I guess you could say it was the beginning of a downward slope in our institutions, just as far as electorally speaking. Really, before then, you don't have too many oddities when it comes to the election. And generally speaking, most political scientists would say before that point that everybody who stepped into the office, whether it was on the Republican side or the Democratic side, generally speaking, the person had some sort of credential. That's sort of, there's some debate over that now, like in the case of George Bush, not to get too, partisan or ideological here, but after his second term. Really, if you go down the list of two-term presidents. Yeah. When you go down the list of two-term presidents, George W. Bush seems to be a bit of an exception to the rule, certainly. Just in terms of how he responded to the crisis, and really, you don't see anybody. C-SPAN has a ranking list of presidents where they, look at 10 different characteristics, and George W. Bush is the only person who's way down on the list. Typically, two-termers, were at least midway. It seems like a lot of historical precedents were broken then. And then, of course, we have 2001, which is another crisis start date that I think if you ask the average person, they would say that for sure that's what they see as the beginning of the crisis era in the United States. But if you look at the response to the event, it doesn't quite line up, I would say.
Now you mentioned that. Oh, you mentioned like line up with what?
Just as far as in past crises, like when there's a crisis, public opinion changes in, I would say, at least a way that can be traced with data in a very sort of stark way. We sort of just doubled down a little bit on, Bush, he originally had a foreign policy that was going to focus in on South America. But, of course, his cabinet was full of officials from his father's administration. And really, it was almost like post-collapse of the Soviet Union. They really didn't know what they wanted to do in the foreign policy sphere. And so it seemed like it was just a doubling down of what had come before. And that strikes me as kind of odd looking back at other crises. And so we come to 2008, where, of course, that's where Neil Howe has landed so far with it. We'll see what it looks like after we get through our current, crisis here. But I tend to lean now a little bit towards 2008 being the crisis start date too, just because I think you can't ignore that in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, you've seen both wings have their respective populist movements. And we'll get into this in, I guess, a future episode where, if you look at Federal Reserve data that came out a couple of months ago, you see that 2008 really affected the attitudes of the public in a way that you just didn't see, I guess, post-2001. So it's a question of, on one hand, David mentioned that the Obama administration, in the way they responded to the crisis, really because of who he had in his cabinet, the response was a little bit more just like a traditional response for an event that, was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And really, it seems like we're about to go through a round two here. And I know all of us are sort of sitting here looking to see what the result of that is going to be. So
round two stimulated by the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic.
Correct. And
just in case somebody watches this in 2030.
Right. And so
thinking ahead.
Right. And not to get too ahead of myself here, but of course, now it's that question of whether we get Trump or Joe Biden next, how are they going to respond to, an unemployment rate that, of course, today exceeded, I believe it's 22 million job claims and rising. And a depression, of course, is characterized by at least, I think it's 3/4 of the economy shrinking plus an unemployment rate over, I believe it's either 20 or 25%. So again, this isn't, it's not the same as the previous crisis because it wasn't the financial markets that caused this. It was more like a combination of the conflict between the Russians and the Saudis over oil, obviously the coronavirus, and really just, it was like a domino effect, really, as opposed to the financial crisis, which was, just banks being reckless and it just a whole train crash of credit rating agencies, rating banks with ratings that they weren't actually at, and everybody borrowing from everyone else. This is a little bit different than that.
World War II set up the U.S. as a great power. I feel like the current crisis, the current 4T, is asking us, are we really a great power? Can we fix our problems? Can we come together? Can we rebuild the infrastructure? Can we basically get over a lot of what we fought on during the 3T and even the 2T, the culture wars? Can we get over ourselves,
right,
in order to mobilize and have what's called a regeneracy? And I first noticed that the polarization was basically blocking all sides of the political spectrum around 2005. I noticed that that's when we had Katrina, and I don't necessarily say Katrina in itself is a crisis, but the response to Katrina highlights the crisis. It is basically showed how government is divided and fights amongst itself, and would rather play the blame game than basically fix things. That is the crisis. Can we fix things, and can we fix ourselves?
I always go back to the sort of main points with a crisis that, again, it's definitely institutions breaking down that have generally held stable for the entire length of the most of the length of the four turnings. And the fact that one thing I've mentioned over and over again in the group is that the high death rate, it seems that we don't have a sort of acute mood shift absent of that, at least going into the major part, the final part of the crisis. That is just something that we never seem to have gotten over. But then you get to the question of, we're in the 21st century now, is a war, something that's just, left over from the 20th century, and do we realistically expect there to be conflict of that level, between states? I don't know. This is definitely testing that, because I could definitely see tensions ratcheting up between countries, but even then, I tend to think this will probably be a more internal crisis, mainly, like I mentioned in our last video, because of the high levels of polarization and constitutional rot. I think that's probably the main piece of the theory. You mentioned that they have the civil wars being an aberration as far as the civic generation then is concerned.
This is very much on my mind. I haven't put this on the webpage yet, but in the last 2 weeks, really, I started something new. I've been working, as you know, researching this book in the 1870s and 80s. But that was pretty much coming to a halt because all the libraries were closed, and that was where my data was coming from that. So I've started something else that's been kicking around in my head for a long time, which I could do quite easily just on the web, which is a relatively brief political history of the United States based on one simple set of sources, which is the inaugural addresses and the State of the Union addresses of the president. And this is going surprisingly quickly with the help of some techniques I've developed for other things. I'm just about through Jefferson already. The thing that is just knocking me over the head, reading Washington and Jefferson in particular, is their keen awareness that they are leading a great experiment to apply Enlightenment values and to form a government based on new principles equality, democracy, majority rule. And it's very interesting too, that nowadays we look back at that early period and we see all the qualifications to democracy. You know, and some people say, no, they weren't creating democracy, they were creating a republic. And of course, there were property qualifications for voting, and there's still slavery. But the language they use does not pay any attention to any of that at all. It's all almost pure democratic language. And several times in key areas, that our basic principles, the rule of the majority prevail. Now, among other things, what we have going on now is an attack on data, an attack on facts, an attack on rationality. And I really think it's an open question as to whether we're going to keep that spirit of the founders, which was sustained in some critical ways by Lincoln, and which Roosevelt and his people returned to even more, because they were trying to redesign the economy and the world order according to rational principles. Whether we're going to keep that spirit alive now, which if we can't, is going to be a tremendous loss for us and for the whole world. It really looks like an open question to me right now.
The book, I brought up regeneracy. Do you believe that we've had a regeneracy already, or is it to come?
You must be joking. No, I don't think we've had a regeneracy already. Although, among the behavior of some relatively younger people, such as yourself and your wife and your family, Ryan Thomas, you can certainly see things going on that look like a regeneracy. But at the top level, no, we haven't. And that's the question. Can we have it? And where's it going to come from? Because, look, I mean, you guys probably remember when Barack Obama came in, I thought this was going to be another New Deal. I was all set to believe the crisis had just started. He was going to lead us to a completely different place. But it didn't happen. So, in the best case scenario, which is at this point if Joe Biden wins, and even if we narrowly take over the Senate, can we really put the country on a different track? I don't know. The other possibility that could lead to a kind of a regeneracy, it seems to me, is that the actual real life problems that we now are going to have to deal with because of the epidemic and the economic crisis. And the economic crisis, frankly, looks like by far the more serious of the two problems to me. Are those going to be so big that we will simply have to put our hopeless partisanship aside at some point? That's possible, although so far I have to say, as you know, I don't see it happening.
If we do have one, obviously the events right now would have to be, I guess, the trigger for it. There would be the most obvious one, the economic fallout, because frankly, this crisis is so wide-ranging and broad that it's really the only thing we've had recently that I can think of that would bring about a regeneracy. I'm sitting here thinking, going through my head, and really nothing else comes to mind. I mean, you know that we're going to have the discussion about the two Atlantic articles talking about the economic impact. They're by Andy Lowry, and they were both the top trending, articles on the Atlantic the week that came out. And one is from early February, where the economy was at an all-time high. And it's funny because in a lot of the article, they have a section about the millennial generation and how bad families are doing during this time because of the, high expenses, housing costs, healthcare, childcare, student debt. They just, kind of go on about all the different expenses. And then, of course, the article that just came out that I posted in the group about the millennial generation now going through 2 once-in-a-lifetime, economic disasters, and how it's going to permanently, put them behind. And they will be the first generation in modern American history to, to be worse off than their parents. And so it just seems to me that if Joe Biden were to come into office, and we can talk later on about what's, been going on in the last 48 hours with regards to, the different task force being set up and, the jockeying back and forth for the VP role and all of that. But I would find it hard. It would be hard for me to believe that there wouldn't be some sort of strong response to it, just because it does look like there's an effort being made to, I guess, bring different people in than me and my friends would have thought that the Biden administration would have, brought to the table. Now, that's still a long ways off from actually, seeing who he picks as Treasury Secretary and going down, the laundry list of different roles. But I tend to think that if a regeneracy is going to happen, it'll probably happen between now and, say, the end of next year.
Well, Joe Biden's part of the silent generation. He's not a prophet.
Right.
The prophets are the baby boomers. David's a prophet. David's a prophet. How do you like that?
Yeah, I know.
So he's part of the silent generation, which is the artist archetype. And I feel that one of the main traits of that cohort, that type, is to compromise, to create a win-win situation. So I'm wondering if the fact that Biden is an artist, will that help him be open to bringing other ideas into the equation instead of my way or the highway? That I can see how a consensus can come out of that.
Well, before I answer that, I do want to say one thing to Darius, to introduce a slight note of hope about the economic future of your generation. What you say may turn out to be true. The only thing I want to say is if we go back to 80 years, the early 1940s, that's probably the way the prospects of the GI generation looked at that moment. I mean, really bleak. And it didn't turn out that way. So let's not give up yet.
Let's not give up. I think just yesterday, Darius and I had a conversation about this, and millennials now is basically the GI generation without a World War II and a GI bill. We need a modern GI bill to help the civic archetype.
That's right. So anyway, in answer to your question, yes, Biden could do a good job of bringing people together. He talks about the way he used to work with Republicans in the Senate, but he can only do it if there's some kind of change of heart among the Republicans. And if they take a bath in the election, let's just say even that can't be ruled out. There's talk, Darius is more up on current politics than I am. I'm seeing a lot of talk that McConnell might be in real trouble. I've even seen talk that Lindsey Graham might be in trouble, close to home for you. So who knows what might happen with shocking suddenness, but we don't know.
What if the change is going to happen regardless of who's president? It seems like we're doing a lot of things now we didn't expect it to years ago.
Some changes will happen regardless of who's president. And we're seeing that. I mean, your generation, the generation behind you, on a whole range of social issues, they have different views than the older generation. And they will live their lives differently than the older generation have. Now, it's never one man as president. Lincoln and FDR brilliantly took advantage of political forces that were there for them to draw upon. And they did that. Now, even if Trump were reelected, which is possible, and I change my mind about the likelihood almost every day, but anyway, we have a lot of governors becoming national figures. Again, because and we're seeing who has the intellectual and political equipment to do that, like Andrew Cuomo and I guess Gavin Newsom, and we're seeing who doesn't. And that will have an effect. Cuomo just ruled himself out, not only as president, but as you may have seen as vice president, over which I have a little bit of regret, although he wasn't likely for other reasons, I guess, to be vice president. But the tradition of activist government solving real problems could be resolved, could be revived at the state and local level. I wouldn't give on that either.
Darius, what do you think needs to happen for this crisis to end successfully and set up a new order? That's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, of course, as you know, I look to other theories and measurements for that. I mean, example, polarization definitely there has to be like a reckoning as far as that's concerned. Again, I do tend to think this has a lot more similarities with the Civil War as opposed to World War II. And that's just because of the, again, high levels of polarization, constitutional rot, just a lot of, you're starting to see it now, the tension between the states and the federal government right now. I think even if Joe Biden were to be president, I don't think that tension would disperse either. Really, in that situation, in order for it to turn out okay, I mean, simply put, there's going to have to be a level of turnout that, again, happens every crisis period, that like there has to be a definitive winner as far as this is concerned, meaning if it's a close election, the tension is probably going to continue to ratchet up. I think everybody can sort of see a scenario where, Trump it's almost like he never left the White House. He'll still, be just as present, I guess, in the news as he is right now.
I believe propaganda is back. We have that actually allows me to go into a current event. So a couple of days ago, Trump released a small video defending himself, saying that he was basically here to stop. He acted on coronavirus right away. He's basically going after all the complaints that he did not respond appropriately. So I'll let you take it from there, Darius.
Yeah, he pretty much put together a reel. It was on like 5 clips, but throughout the entire conference, he was saying, "Oh, I have all these clips. We have hundreds of them." But he played a reel of governors and people who had criticized him actually giving him compliments. And it's funny because in the beginning, he has, January in there and goes through that entire month of the media and politicians saying everything was fine, as if to say that I reacted when I did and everybody else at the time was saying, things were fine, so I'm okay. And then he skips over all of February and then, goes into March. It is so, and I mean, it took up a good 5, it was like a 5-minute reel. And then he spends the next 15 minutes, going back and forth with journalists about the timeline. Of course, in the group, I posted an actual timeline from, week to week. That shows that he was it was brought to his attention by his deputy national security advisor on January 27th or 28th. And he, ignored it. So to your point, yeah, propaganda, at least as it pertains to Trump and his campaign, he definitely sees the briefings as an opportunity to do that.
And I think,
if I may, I thought that was a depressing and potentially significant moment in American history, because what I saw there was, it's official. Mm-hmm. Fox News is now the Ministry of Propaganda.
That's where I was
And
going.
they produced this for him to present at the White House at a moment of national urgency. And frankly, I mean, the question of what he will try to do to the country if he is reelected is very frightening. I mean, I've never thought that, you know, hundreds of thousands of us are headed for concentration camps or anything like that. But still, he is trying to reshape the U.S. in fundamental people around him trying to help, of the William Barrs in the first place. And this could go in some very negative direction.
So we have so basically we have the return of agitprop.
Yes.
Um,
And really, I mean, some of this is really on the level of what you would hear from a totalitarian dictatorship of the 20th century, or the kind of thing that Orwell satirized in 1984. Because, you know, regrets is progress, war is freedom, war is peace, freedom is slavery, etc. I mean, a lot of what Trump says is almost at that level. You know, we have more than enough testing. We have more testing than anybody in the world. We don't have anywhere near enough testing, and everybody knows it.
Mm-hmm.
so it seems like authoritarianism is big during the end of 4T. I believe 1/4T we had a series of witch hunts. But then if you look at the 1T, you have McCarthyism. And so,
Well, that was something I wanted to say a little while ago about polarization,
okay,
which could cut in either direction. Polarization has also been very big early in what we call the high. After the revolution, it probably peaked in the John Adams administration. It remained very high in the 1870s, as I've been finding out. And it was very high in the Truman era. And it's Jefferson, and then to some extent Arthur and Garfield and Hayes, I think, who toned it down some, and then Grover Cleveland, and then it's Ike who tones it down in the 50s. So it's not going to disappear the moment the crisis is over. Of course, you know, you could suggest I'm saying maybe the crisis is already over, but now with Corona, I certainly don't think that.
well, that's my question. How will we know? How will we know when the 4T is over? I have a feeling, I suspect that we may not know until we're midway through the 1T, and then next you know, we're having a debate. When did the 1T begin? How do you know?
I think some clear, sincere gestures from the White House actually could go a long way, as they did. I mean, Jefferson, okay, it was inaugural in 1800 when the electoral system was almost broken down. You know, the election going to the House of Representatives, but he pulled it out as he deserved it. And he said, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." I mean, that was a significant moment, and it worked.
Well, there you have it. So what's next? That's basically, we definitely know that we're in a crisis moment, but how do we get out of this moment? To be continued.
I don't know.
Yeah, just to add on to David's point there, you have, again, if you look at levels of polarization, sometimes it can take as long as 40 years for it to really disperse. It's, like you said, not something that just goes away.
But then, you know, another country might be interesting, China, you know, which had totalitarian polarization for 35 years. And then it really changed very much, very quickly under Deng Xiaoping. And I mean, they're still an authoritarian state, but they've never gone back to anything like that.
Right. And that's just that whole question of, you know, does this apply to different types of political regimes? And just, you know, that whole question, that's a totally different can of worms to open.
So has the theory proven itself to be true for you? You've been with it for so many years now, David. What do you think?
Yes, I think the cycle is real. Now, it turned out, though, that they were too optimistic about how this crisis was going to go because they thought my generation would demonstrate leadership capabilities that it was not demonstrated. I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons, I think. And again, well, it's a little late to get into this one, but also I think concentrated economic power has become a threat to the possibility of regeneracy because it's not clear that states are going to be able to mobilize the kind of resources they need to really get things going in a different direction. I mean, that's a huge topic, but I think it's a big question. So we'll have to wait and see. That's, by the way, something that's really worrying me about this depression that we're going into, which is probably going to make the rich richer and the strong economic institutions stronger and the weaker ones weaker and disappear, and even accelerate the trend we are. So we'll have to wait. Boy, it sure looks an awfully good time for a universal basic income, funded by a wealth tax. I mean, you know, looks almost obvious. So who knows? Maybe that will come out of the woodwork. Vice President Warren will be put in charge of making that happen. I mean, I don't know. And
Maybe we'll have a glorious revolution. That was a 4T. Talk about that.
Right.
Maybe we'll have a glorious revolution.
Yeah, and that was among the 1%. Too.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you, David Kaiser, for joining us tonight. And I think I look forward to you joining us again because you have a lot to share. All righty.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.